Imagine the British Empire at its height. Red splashed across maps from Africa to Asia, the oceans patrolled by ships flying the Union Jack, and London standing as the beating heart of global trade. School books will tell you it was discipline, innovation, and naval dominance that made this empire great. But beneath the uniforms, the cannons, and the so-called civilizing mission, there's a story of shadowy finances, private fortunes, and secret networks of money that quietly greased the gears of empire. The truth is, Britain didn't conquer the world on courage alone. It conquered the world with capital. And the sources of that capital often came from some of the darkest and most controversial places imaginable. Let's peel this back to the 1600s. Britain, at the time, wasn't yet the juggernaut we picture. Spain and Portugal were raking in treasure from the Americas. The Dutch were miles ahead in trade, and France had vast resources on the continent. England was relatively small, poor, and politically unstable. So how did it climb from scrappy island to global superpower? The answer lies in how it leveraged money, specifically the invention of new financial tools and a willingness to finance empire through debt, monopolies, and yes, dirty money. Take the founding of the Bank of England in 1694. This wasn't just some bureaucratic institution. It was a revolutionary idea. Instead of the crowns scraping for funds through taxes or begging aristocrats, the bank allowed the government to borrow massive sums from private investors in exchange for guaranteed interest payments. That meant wars could be fought on credit. And let's be real, empire was expensive. Maintaining ships, armies, fortifications, and colonies drained resources at insane rates. But now, with a tap into the new money markets of London, Britain could outspend its rivals. Debt became fuel for conquest. And this wasn't clean money. Much of it was tied to private companies that doubled as arms of the state. Enter the East India Company, arguably the most infamous corporation in history. Founded in 1600, it wasn't just a trading outfit swapping spices and silks. It was a financial engine that fused commerce with imperialism. Backed by investors in London, it raised its own armies, signed treaties, and ran territories. The profits were astronomical, not only from trade, but from outright exploitation, monopolizing goods, manipulating local economies, and eventually taxing entire populations in India. Shareholders back home weren't just making dividends, they were underwriting empire with private profits, funding public power. But here's where the story darkens further. The British Empire's financial foundations leaned heavily on slavery in the slave trade. Between the 17th and early 19th centuries, British ships carried millions of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. The human suffering was immeasurable, but from the cold lens of finance, this system generated staggering wealth. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean were some of the most profitable operations on Earth, pumping cash back to London banks, insuring cargoes, and creating fortunes that financed everything from stately homes to naval fleets. Even after abolition, the financial aftershocks lingered. Slave owners were compensated by the British government for their losses, while the enslaved received nothing. That money stayed in circulation, folded into the empire's financial bloodstream. If you think of the British Empire as a giant machine, then the gears weren't only turned by taxes and patriotism. They were turned by private banking families like the Rothschilds, whose loans and credit arrangements kept governments solvent and armies supplied. They were turned by insurance houses like Lloyd's of London, which made fortunes underwriting voyages, including slave ships and risky colonial expeditions. They were turned by a rising merchant class who speculated on everything from Indian textiles to Chinese tea. This wasn't random, it was systemic. A tightly woven web of capital tied Britain's financial markets to its imperial ambitions. By the 18th century, London wasn't just a political capital, it was the financial hub of the world. Foreign monarchs borrowed there, trade was priced there, and colonial companies floated shares there. Wars that might have bankrupted other states became manageable for Britain because its debt was spread among thousands of investors. Bonds were bought and sold like commodities, meaning risk was socialized. In other words, while soldiers bled on battlefields, the financial elite made tidy profits. Whether campaigns succeeded or failed, the empire wasn't simply powered by the crown, it was backed by the invisible hand of capital. And let's not forget opium. Few episodes reveal the dark marriage of money and empire as starkly as the Opium Wars of the 19th century. When Britain found itself bleeding silver to pay for Chinese tea, it turned to narcotics. British merchants with government backing funneled opium grown in India into China. The result? Millions addicted, a society destabilized, and China forced into humiliating trade concessions after military defeat. It was drug money on an imperial scale, and it enriched not just smugglers, but also the London financial houses that bankrolled the trade. This is what made the empire great, not noble ideals, but profits built on exploitation, addiction, and coercion. Now here's the kicker. Much of the system was invisible to ordinary Britons. The average citizen might wave the flag, cheer for naval victories, or sip tea without realizing how it all linked back to shadowy financial deals. The real power brokers weren't necessarily the politicians. They were the directors sitting on company boards, the bankers managing loans, the investors speculating on cargoes from halfway around the world. Empire wasn't just military might, it was a ledger, and those who controlled it shaped global history. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Many of these financial innovations didn't disappear with the empire. Debt-financed warfare? Still here. Corporations with quasi-governmental powers? Still here. Exploitation of cheap labor for profit? Still here. The British may have pioneered the model, but the world kept the blueprint. So the next time you hear about the glory of the British Empire, remember that behind the speeches and statues stood money, dark money, money from slavery, from drugs, from exploitative monopolies, and from a banking system that treated human suffering as just another line on a balance sheet. That's the foundation of empire, and it's a story far too often left out of the textbooks. By the 19th century, the British Empire had become more than a political project. It was a financial ecosystem so deeply entrenched that it reshaped not just colonies, but the entire global economy. London stood at the center of a vast web of credit, insurance, and investment that spanned continents. And yet, what made the system so powerful wasn't simply the scale of Britain's wealth. It was how seamlessly financial institutions, private fortunes, and imperial policy intertwined to create a self-reinforcing cycle of expansion. Let's start with the bond markets. Wars are notoriously expensive, and Britain fought more wars than almost any other European power. From the Napoleonic Wars to colonial conflicts in Africa and Asia, the bills piled up astronomically. But unlike its rivals, Britain had mastered the art of borrowing for empire. Through the Bank of England and the rise of public debt markets, Britain turned war into a kind of collective investment scheme. Ordinary citizens, merchants, aristocrats, even small savers bought government bonds. Each bond sold wasn't just a loan to the crown, it was a stake in imperial dominance. Victory meant economic stability and repayment. Defeat? Well, defaults were rare because the system was designed to ensure repayment through taxation in future colonial spoils. This widespread participation democratized empire's financing, but not its profits. The dividends of conquest flowed disproportionately to finance and industrialists, while the costs were borne by soldiers and taxpayers. The genius and the darkness was in how Britain normalized endless borrowing. Debt didn't just fund wars, it became a permanent feature of governance, an invisible tether binding the empire's fate to financial markets. Nowhere was this marriage of finance and empire clearer than in India. After the East India Company transitioned into direct British rule in the mid-19th century, India became the empire's financial keystone. Tax revenues from Indian peasants didn't just support colonial administration, they underwrote Britain's global operations. Imagine a farmer in Bengal paying land tax. Those rupees could be converted into sterling bills in London, which then backed loans funding railroads in Africa or military expeditions in Afghanistan. India became the empire's ATM, a constant flow of liquidity that sustained expansion far beyond its borders. But it wasn't just taxation. The empire also used India as a testing ground for financial extraction. The infamous home charges system funneled Indian wealth back to Britain in the form of payments for administration, pensions, and interest on public debt. In today's terms, billions were siphoned annually out of India with little reinvestment in the colony itself. Economists like Dadabhai Naruji called this the drain of wealth, arguing that Britain's prosperity was built on systematically bleeding India dry. And London bankers loved it. Indian revenues provided a stable income stream that guaranteed bondholders their returns, turning colonial exploitation into a cornerstone of global finance. Meanwhile, Britain's Industrial Revolution added rocket fuel to this financial machine. Factories in Manchester and Birmingham churned out textiles, weapons, and machinery at unprecedented scales. But industries needed raw materials: cotton, coal, rubber, tea, and they needed markets to sell their goods. Empire solved both problems, and finance provided the glue. Banks extended credit to merchants shipping cotton from Egypt. Insurance houses covered the risks of tea cargoes from Ceylon. And stock markets in London buzzed with shares of mining companies in South Africa. Every transaction tied colonial exploitation back to financial gains at home. This system, however, carried dark consequences. Take cotton. After the American Civil War disrupted cotton supplies, Britain turned aggressively to India and Egypt to fill the gap. Indian peasants were forced into cash crop production, often at the expense of food cultivation. Famines followed, killing millions. Yet, from the perspective of the London markets, it was simply an adjustment in supply chains. The misery of entire populations was reduced to a fluctuation in prices and bond yields. That's what dark money does. It strips human suffering down to numbers on a ledger. And then there was Africa. The so-called scramble for Africa in the late 19th century wasn't just about planting flags, it was about financial speculation. Mining companies floated on the London Stock Exchange, promising riches from diamonds in South Africa or gold in the Transvaal. Investors rushed in, eager to grab a slice of imperial profits. Behind them came the British Army, ensuring stability for these enterprises. It wasn't coincidence that wars like the Anglo-Zulu conflict or the Boer War followed so closely on the heels of resource discoveries. Finance demanded security for its investments, and empire delivered it no matter the cost in lives. The link between finance and imperial violence grew even more explicit in China. The Opium Wars weren't just fought for trade rights, they were fought to protect financial flows. British merchants with backing from banks and insurance houses pushed opium into Chinese markets to correct Britain's trade deficit. When China resisted, the British military enforced compliance. Once again, financial interests dictated foreign policy. The profits from opium sales didn't just enrich traders, they flowed back into the London markets, underpinning loans and investments that fueled the empire elsewhere. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of this financial empire was its invisibility to the average Briton. Newspapers trumpeted victories, explorers, and royal ceremonies, but the true engine, the dark money, rarely made headlines. The wealth flowing through Rothschild loans, Baring Brothers investments, or Lloyd's insurance contracts wasn't just abstract finance, it was the bloodstream of empire. Yet for ordinary people in Britain, empire often appeared as cheap tea, affordable textiles, and patriotic pride, without recognition of the financial exploitation behind it. Critics saw through the facade. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, thinkers like John Hobson argued that imperialism wasn't driven by national pride or strategic necessity, it was driven by financiers seeking new markets for investment. Empire, he claimed, was simply the outward expansion of capital. And though his critique was radical at the time, history has largely vindicated him. The financial interests of a small elite dictated the trajectory of the largest empire in history. By the eve of World War I, Britain's empire had become a paradox. Militarily, it was stretched thin. Politically, it faced rising challenges from Germany and the United States. But financially, it remained dominant. Sterling was the world's reserve currency, London the clearinghouse of global trade. Yet this supremacy rested on foundations of exploitation, debt, and dark money. The empire's strength wasn't just measured in battleships, it was measured in balance sheets, and that meant its survival depended less on the will of parliaments and more on the decisions of bankers. This is the uncomfortable legacy of Britain's rise, an empire built not solely on bravery or innovation, but on a financial architecture that commodified human lives and natural resources. Every conquest, every colony, every treaty carried with it a hidden balance sheet, and in those balance sheets lay the true story of how Britain ruled the world, not by divine right, but by financial design. As the 20th century dawned, the British Empire looked invincible on the surface.
The sun famously never set on its dominions, its navy commanded the seas, and London remained the unquestioned capital of global finance. Yet beneath this grandeur, cracks were forming. The very financial machine that had fueled Britain's rise also planted the seeds of vulnerability, and the story of dark money was about to collide with a rapidly changing world. The first challenge came from competition. Germany and the United States were industrializing at lightning speed, and with them came new banks, new markets, and new financial systems. Britain still dominated in global lending, but cracks in its monopoly were visible. German banks were funding heavy industries in Europe, and Wall Street was beginning to rival the City of London in international clout. For the first time in centuries, Britain's financial supremacy wasn't unchallenged. But instead of retreating, Britain doubled down. It relied even more heavily on its colonies as sources of cheap capital and reliable markets, binding them tighter through financial dependence. Nowhere was this clearer than in the use of sterling preference. Colonies and dominions were pressured or outright compelled to conduct trade and hold reserves in British sterling. The system effectively trapped them inside a financial orbit centered on London. If a colony needed credit, it went to British banks. If it sold goods abroad, the payments often flowed through sterling accounts. The empire wasn't just political, it was financial infrastructure, and dark money powered every circuit. But while sterling preference kept colonies dependent, it also masked growing imbalances. Britain increasingly consumed more than it produced, importing food and raw materials while exporting financial services. In other words, the empire was becoming less a factory of goods and more a factory of credit. The problem with the credit empire, however, is that it works only as long as others believe in its solvency. When that belief wavers, the entire system trembles. And tremble it did. The First World War was the ultimate stress test for Britain's financial empire. Financing 4 years of unprecedented conflict required sums that even the Bank of England couldn't conjure alone. Britain borrowed heavily, particularly from the United States. The war revealed the limits of British financial supremacy. Suddenly, London was no longer the sole creditor to the world, it was a debtor. The irony was brutal. The empire that had funded its rise through endless borrowing now found itself reliant on Wall Street for survival. After the war, Britain tried to restore its old financial dominance. The gold standard was reimposed, sterling was elevated again, and the empire sought to stabilize its balance sheets by squeezing even more wealth out of its colonies. India once more bore the brunt of this extraction. Grain was exported even during famines to prop up Britain's economy, and taxation levels remained crushing. But history had shifted. The colonies were no longer passive cash machines.